Hey there, I'm Dr. Barbara Woods, and we are going to talk about the intergenerational trauma transmission cycle today. But first, I am going to need to share this into my Facebook group because Facebook and my live streaming software still are not playing nice together. So I will share this quickly and we will go from there. So I hope you are having a wonderful day. We are having such nice weather here in Manitoba that it's honestly unbelievable. We've only had a few days that were under like 40 below or 30 below, I think we had, which is very nice to have these nice warm temperatures. So everything is shared. We will get started. Today I have some slides that we will look at. Because it's really important to get a visual on this. Whoops. And I should have gotten queued up to where I needed to be. So we're going to talk about the intergenerational trauma transmission cycle. And this is how trauma is passed between generations. And we're also going to talk about how do we stop this. So this is basically the cycle. And we're going to go into these 5 stages in more depth. So you've got epigenetics and previous generations. So these are historical, cultural, collective traumas that previous generations have had that have impacted the generations following. So trauma can cause genetic changes. And it can kind of it's almost like putting red flags on DNA that if the next generation, say it's a famine, the next generation experiences something similar, it'll trigger a gene that will help for survival. But unfortunately, there may be repercussions or there may be things that health consequences, things like that. So there's 4 main ways that intergenerational trauma can be transmitted. So there are these epigenetic changes. There's the in utero environment where during pregnancy, if the mother is experiencing certain like stressful circumstances, traumas, family violence, it can impact the development of the fetus. Then there's the early developmental environment, which if there's, especially from 0 to 3 years old, if there's a lot of disruption in trauma, it can disrupt the brain development, attachment, all of that. And then you also have just family patterns that you'll see through generations. Like if you do a genogram or look back in other generations, you'll see these patterns that kind of emerge, but there's no, you can't really link them back to certain experiences. It's just kind of how the culture of the family kind of developed over time. So next is the parents' developmental trauma. That's number 2. So if they grow up in an environment or they're impacted by one of those 4 pathways for intergenerational trauma transmission, it affects their development. It disrupts their attachment, their brain development, all of that. So the next is the parents so if this developmental trauma occurs, and there's no intervention or there's no healing, then the parent's becomes unresolved complex trauma as an adult. Then that affects their child's development, and they may experience developmental trauma if this cycle isn't stopped. And then the child may have unresolved complex trauma that then when they become parents, it just goes back around the cycle. So this is the main cycle that we're going to kind of concentrate on. So again, epigenetics, this is the changes in DNA and all those things that kind of influence our health, our well-being, and those kinds of things, those 4 pathways of intergenerational trauma transmission are the epigenetics, the in utero environment, early developmental environment, and those patterns that we see in families. So there's not much at this level that we can do. We can practice good health, know what we're kind of vulnerable to kind of offset any of those genetic changes, but it's really kind of stuff that happened before the families that we're working with were alive. So they're patterns that we really can't access. So growing up in a situation where there's a lot of trauma, maybe family violence, maybe environmental things, could be hurricanes, disasters, pandemics. So the parent, as they're a child and they're developing, they may have developmental trauma, which means the trauma that they've experienced has impacted them over a period of time where they were in a critical developmental period. So typically what you see, there's several impacts of developmental trauma, but what we're particularly interested in is how it disrupts attachment. So this parent didn't have the attachment needs that they had. They weren't met, or they learned skills and strategies that got them through and helped them survive, but then they become a problem later on. Also, it disrupts brain development. So you can see difficulties for children who are experiencing chronic trauma. They sometimes have learning difficulties. There can be language difficulties because the brain is hijacked and all of the focus is on survival, which are in the lower brain centers, and then where all that cognitive development happens. So in part of the brain development that can be disrupted is emotion regulation. So they may have there's two circuits in the brain that if they don't get the shaping and the interaction that they need to get that emotion regulation, and if they constantly live under threat, it causes difficulties with emotion regulation where they neurocept or sense danger and threat where there may not be any danger or threat, or they're highly sensitive to their environments because they're hypervigilant. So this is the parent. So the parents had this childhood trauma, which is complex, it's developmental, it occurs during very specific developmental times, and it disrupts that development. So as the parent ages, they could be considered as having unresolved complex trauma. So if there's no treatment, if there's no therapy, if there's no corrective attachment experiences, and life just kind of goes on, the unresolved trauma from childhood impacts their own attachment and developmental environment of their child. So they carry these attachment, emotion regulation difficulties with them into their relationship with their child. Then the child then experiences developmental trauma similar to what the parent had experienced, and it disrupts attachment. In the parent-child relationship, it disrupts co-regulation. So it may be really hard to soothe and calm a child that is experiencing developmental trauma because of the attachment, and the parent may not be able to co-regulate because of the impacts of their own complex trauma. So this leads to impacts on the child where they have difficulties with emotion regulation. So they may perceive threat very quickly. They may be highly reactive, difficult to settle and soothe, impacts their brain development as well in this second generation. And then if the child doesn't have any intervention, there's no resolution to their trauma experience, and there's no shifting of their attachment patterns, there's no help with emotion regulation, they experience significant impacts across several life domains, and there's poor life outcomes. So you'll see higher rates of incarceration, less education, just really big time struggles, because this is kind of the outcomes if we don't help resolve these traumas. So how do we do this? How do we stop intergenerational trauma transmission? So basically, if we look at this cycle and we have seen that it goes from the parent's developmental trauma, so level 2 goes through this process, the parent has unresolved complex trauma, their child experiences developmental trauma, the child has unresolved complex trauma, and then when they parent, it just goes right back to the parent's developmental trauma. So we can't really get to epigenetics. We can't, unless there's some health factors and things like that, we may be able to influence by having healthy lifestyles and making those changes for prevention. But we really can't access this first level of the epigenetics and what's happened previously. We also can't access the parent's developmental trauma because it's in the past, it's already happened, and it's shifted into an adult's experience of complex trauma. So this is their unresolved trauma from childhood. So this, we can access that. We can support parents to deal with the impacts of what their experience was. We can help them gain coping skills. We can help them with, by co-regulating with them in therapy, then they learn to co-regulate their child and they learn better self-regulation. So then that shifts this change in the parent's unresolved complex trauma. So if we help resolve this complex trauma, it transmits down because then the child's developmental environment is somewhat different. It may not have as many impacts, or those impacts of this transmission cycle will be lessened because there was intervention. And then it just kind of totally prevents the child from having unresolved complex trauma as a later teen or adult. So this is how we break that cycle, is by getting in, working with the parent's unresolved complex trauma, and also working with the child so that we're teaching those, giving them co-regulation, helping the parent give them co-regulation so that they get better self-regulation, and we minimize the impacts of the trauma that they've experienced. So there are 3 steps to interrupt this cycle that are really important if you're working with complex families that are impacted by intergenerational trauma. First, we want to calm the family nervous system. We want to take kind of the heat and the reactivity out of the family system. We want to address the caregiver's unresolved trauma, and then we want to address the child or teen's unresolved trauma. And at the same time, we want to build connection and family resilience. So step 1, when we look at calming the family nervous system, we want to support the caregiver to improve their self-regulation through co-regulation with us as a therapist and additional intervention. So we want them to really be able to self-regulate, particularly in the parent-child relationship. So, and we want to do this because it'll increase the parent's capacity for co-regulating their child. And that's how those emotion regulation circuits in the brain are shaped. They're through experience. When you have somebody there to help you get back to a state of regulation, that is how we kind of shift this and start building those circuits in a healthier, more positive way. So we also want to increase the safety and stabilization of the family system. That's why we want to take the heat and the reactivity out of the family, because we want all people in the family to have the experience of safety in those relationships, and we want it to become fairly stable in having that safety and in their relationships. So what this is going to do is it's going to improve that parent-child attachment. It's going to give the parent the skills that they need to have a different attachment experience with their child. It may also help them gain earned secure attachment, where that's if a person has had attachment disruptions or impacts, then when they have a corrective relationship that is supportive, nurturing and supports their development of different attachment strategies that are more secure, they're then able to give that to their child. And you'll see a decrease in behavioral disruption. So the child's needs will be getting met. They'll be closer and attached to the parents, and you'll see a decrease in some of the behaviors that can really up the heat in a family system. So step 2 is to address the caregiver's unresolved trauma. So we want to support the caregiver to resolve and integrate their trauma experience from their own childhood and probably into adulthood. So what we want is improvements in autonomic resilience. And what that means is the autonomic nervous system is related to the fight, flight, freeze responses that cause the reactivity and can cause faulty neuroception, which is the detection of threat when there really isn't any threat. So when we increase autonomic resilience, it's easier to become self-regulated. It's easier to get back to a state of regulation after having had a fight, flight, or freeze response. And we're less reactive and less likely to have faulty neuroception. So that autonomic resilience is extremely important for the caregiver or the parent and the child. And they have more flexibility. There's more time between when something happens, like a stimulus, and how they respond to it. So they have a lot more flexibility in how they respond. So if a child makes loud noises and it triggers the parent's kind of fight or flight response, it gives them more time so they can just take a deep breath, re-regulate, and not go into a reactive response to that child's behavior. As a result of all these, the autonomic resilience and increased flexibility, they have improved emotion regulation. So the caregiver is really able to be there for the child, support their emotions without getting overwhelmed by their own emotions. Step 3 is to address the child's unresolved trauma and build that connection and family resilience. So we also want to resolve and integrate the child's trauma experience because they're likely to have some impacts from growing up in an environment where there's intergenerational trauma present. So what we want to do in this part is we really want to support and reinforce the parenting strategies and skills that they've learned in that step 1. So we want to keep building those skills, keep supporting them to develop these skills as the child progresses through their own trauma therapy. And we want to build even greater connection in that parent-child relationship. We want that attachment and that connection to be really strong and to have more security than what they had previously. And then the last part of this is to increase family resilience and honor the generational resilience. So one of the things that you'll see in families is we talk about the intergenerational trauma and how these things get passed on, but a lot of times we miss the strengths or the things that the risks that people took or the chances that they took in order to preserve the next generation. And it may not have stopped the transmission of the intergenerational trauma if there wasn't therapy for all this complex trauma. But there's strengths back in the family that it's really important to honor and to bring into the family's current life and understanding of their family history, because it can be a huge resource. And the main thing is if people have gone through all these different traumas and they survived, there's resilience there. And we need to look back in the family and see maybe leaving a certain area and moving away from the family of origin was difficult, and it caused difficulties with not having supports, having to reestablish yourself. But there may be some resilience in that because it prevented the impacts from the interactions with previous generations. So thank you for attending, and I hope this is helpful. I have a handout that if you would like a copy of it, just message me and I will be sure to send it on. And I hope you have a beautiful day.